The morning air in the Bennett household was filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the faint sounds of the news anchor droning on about the weather. Scott Bennett sipped from his favorite mug, the one Monica had bought him as a joke on their 3rd anniversary. It read, "World's okayest husband." He smiled faintly at the memory as he clicked through his work emails on his laptop. This was his life. Calm, predictable, and comfortably mundane. Today, Scott had plans. A routine business trip to Chicago, followed by a short weekend getaway that he and Monica had talked about for weeks. It wasn't exotic or extravagant, but it was a break from the grind, something they both needed. Monica had joked the night before that maybe this time they'd actually leave the hotel room instead of spending all their time in bed. He'd laughed, even as a small voice in the back of his head noted a subtle change in her tone. Light, but maybe a little forced. Scott dismissed the thought as pre-trip nerves. He had been putting in longer hours at work lately, a side effect of trying to position himself for a promotion. Monica understood. She always did. As he threw the last of his toiletries into his suitcase, he heard Monica's soft footsteps behind him. She appeared in the doorway, her dark hair tied back in a loose ponytail, wearing one of his oversized college sweatshirts. She looked comfortable, almost too comfortable. "You all packed?" she asked, leaning against the frame with a mug of her own in hand. "Just about," Scott replied, zipping the suitcase shut. "I'll call you tonight after I land. Don't wait up for me." Monica gave a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course. Have a safe flight." Scott hesitated, stepping closer to kiss her goodbye. Her lips were warm but unresponsive, as if her mind was elsewhere. "Everything okay?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yeah," Monica said quickly, pulling back just slightly. "Just tired. You know how it is." Scott wanted to push, but the clock was ticking. He had a flight to catch, and he knew from experience that Monica hated being interrogated. So, he let it go. At the airport, Scott went through the motions of travel. Check-in, security, boarding. The hum of anticipation he usually felt before a trip was conspicuously absent, replaced by an unshakable feeling of unease. He chalked it up to stress, work, the trip, the anniversary looming on the horizon that neither of them had mentioned. They had been married for 12 years, and in the last few months, he couldn't help but feel a slight, almost imperceptible drift between them. But marriages went through phases, didn't they? This was just one of those lulls. They would work through it, like they always did. The flight to Chicago was uneventful, the kind of journey where the seatbelt light stays off most of the time, and the in-flight entertainment isn't half bad. By the time the plane touched down, Scott's earlier unease had dulled into the background, replaced by thoughts of the presentation he would give the next day. The hotel was a towering monument of modern luxury, complete with glass elevators and a lobby that smelled faintly of citrus and lavender. As Scott checked in and dragged his suitcase to his room, he felt the weight of the day finally beginning to lift. After unpacking, he decided to grab a drink at the bar before heading to bed. He wasn't much of a drinker, but something about the polished mahogany counter and the muted clink of glasses felt comforting. And that was when he saw her. Sitting at the far end of the bar, Deborah Harris looked almost exactly as she had when they were in college. The years had been kind to her, but there was a subtle maturity in the way she held herself now, a confidence that hadn't been there before. Scott froze, unsure whether to approach or quietly slink away. But Deborah spotted him first. "Scott Bennett," she called, her voice warm and familiar. "Is that really you?" He had no choice now. He smiled and walked over, feeling a rush of nostalgia as she stood to greet him. "Deborah," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "It's been a long time." "Too long," she replied, pulling him into a quick, friendly hug. Her perfume was intoxicating, a blend of floral and something he couldn't quite place. "What are the odds we'd run into each other here?" Before he could answer, another figure appeared. A tall man with sharp features and an expensive watch. "Oh, this is my husband, Roger," Deborah said, her smile tightening just a bit. Scott shook the man's hand, feeling a strange undercurrent of tension as Roger sized him up. For the rest of the evening, they shared polite conversation over drinks. Deborah laughed at his stories, her eyes sparkling in a way that made him forget about Roger entirely. But as the night wore on, Scott couldn't shake the feeling that something about this encounter wasn't as innocent as it seemed. Scott hadn't planned to stay at the bar long, but Deborah's presence made it impossible to leave. The way she leaned in as they talked, her soft laughter at his jokes, and the occasional brush of her hand against his arm. It was disarming, a window into a past he'd long since closed. Her husband, Roger, had excused himself after a drink, claiming fatigue from travel. Scott had expected Deborah to follow, but instead, she ordered another glass of Chardonnay and turned her full attention to him. "So," she said, her tone tinged with curiosity, "Chicago for business, or is this a pleasure trip?" "Business," Scott replied, taking a sip of his whiskey. "I have a presentation tomorrow, but it's nothing groundbreaking." "You?" She smiled, twirling the stem of her glass between her fingers. "Roger's here for a conference. I'm just tagging along, playing the dutiful wife." Her words carried a faint bitterness that Scott couldn't ignore. "Dutiful, huh? That doesn't sound like the Deborah I remember." Deborah chuckled, a rich, throaty sound that pulled at something deep in his chest. "Time changes people, Scott, but not everything. Some things stay the same." There it was, an edge to her voice, subtle but unmistakable. Scott shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the bar as if searching for an escape. "Do you ever think about those days?" she asked, breaking the silence. Her eyes locked onto his, an intensity in them that made his pulse quicken. "Which days?" "You know," she said, her lips curving into a knowing smile. "The late-night drives, the way we'd skip classes just to lie in bed all day. How wild we were back then." Scott chuckled nervously, feeling a heat rise in his face. "We were kids, Deborah. It was a long time ago." "Not that long," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed together. Do you ever think about that?" He froze, unsure how to respond. His mind raced, memories flooding back unbidden. Deborah's infectious energy, the way she'd always been able to talk him into anything, and the nights they'd spent tangled in each other's arms, laughing about the future. But that was before Monica, before he'd built the life he had now. "Deborah," he began carefully, "we were great together, but it wouldn't have worked. You know that." She tilted her head, studying him with a faint smile. "Maybe. Or maybe we just didn't give it a real chance." The conversation was heading into dangerous territory, and Scott knew he should walk away. But the pull of nostalgia, and the warmth in Deborah's gaze, rooted him in place. Before he could respond, Deborah's phone buzzed on the bar. She glanced at it, her expression tightening. "Roger," she said with a roll of her eyes. "I told him I'd be back soon. Guess I should go." Scott felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. "But hey," she added, her tone lightening, "are you going to the reunion tomorrow night?" He hesitated. He'd forgotten all about the invitation that had been buried under a pile of mail weeks ago. He hadn't planned to attend, but now, "I wasn't planning to," he admitted. "You should," Deborah said, her eyes gleaming. "It'll be fun. A chance to reconnect, catch up with everyone." She placed her hand on his arm, lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. "I hope I see you there." And with that, she slipped off the bar stool and disappeared into the hotel's labyrinth of hallways. The next evening, Scott found himself in a banquet hall filled with familiar faces and laughter that echoed from wall to wall. The college reunion was exactly what he had expected. A mix of nostalgia, awkward small talk, and the occasional boastful story from someone trying to relive their glory days. And then there was Deborah. She arrived fashionably late, dressed in a deep red cocktail dress that hugged her figure in a way that made heads turn. Scott wasn't immune. He found himself staring, unable to help the way his chest tightened when their eyes met across the room. "Scott," she said warmly as she approached, her lips curling into a smile. "You came." He nodded, trying to keep his expression neutral. "Figured I might as well. Good to see everyone again." "Everyone?" she teased, raising an eyebrow. "Okay, maybe not everyone," he admitted, a small smile tugging at his lips. They spent the evening mingling with old friends, sharing laughs and memories that felt like lifetimes ago. But the electricity between Scott and Deborah was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every touch, carried a weight that neither of them acknowledged aloud. As the night wore on, the crowd began to thin. Deborah leaned in, her voice low. "Want to get some air?" Scott hesitated but nodded, following her out onto the balcony. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the heat of the room, but his pulse quickened as Deborah stepped closer, her proximity intoxicating. "Scott," she said softly, her hand brushing against his. "I miss this."
Us.
He swallowed hard, his heart pounding. The space between them felt charged, fragile, like a thread pulled taut. "You're married," he said finally, his voice strained. "So are you," she countered, her eyes searching his. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken desires. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Deborah smiled faintly, stepping back. "Good night, Scott," she whispered, her voice filled with something that felt dangerously like regret. As she disappeared into the night, Scott was left standing alone, the city lights casting long shadows around him. His mind swirled with confusion, guilt, and a longing he hadn't felt in years. The drive home from Chicago was uneventful, but Scott couldn't shake the events of the weekend from his mind. Deborah's presence lingered like a haunting melody, familiar, nostalgic, but ultimately unsettling. He kept replaying their conversations, her touch on his arm, and the way she had looked at him during the reunion. A part of him felt guilty for indulging in her company, but another part, a darker, buried part, couldn't deny how alive it had made him feel. By the time Scott pulled into his driveway late Sunday evening, he was exhausted, physically and emotionally. The house was dark, save for the soft glow of the living room lamp filtering through the curtains. Monica must have left it on for him. The small gesture tugged at his heart, easing some of the guilt that had taken root over the weekend. He grabbed his suitcase and headed inside. The quiet stillness of the house was welcoming, comforting even after the whirlwind of Chicago. "Monica?" he called out, setting his suitcase down by the door. "In here," came her reply, soft and lilting. Scott followed her voice into the living room, where he stopped dead in his tracks. Monica stood by the fireplace, her silhouette framed by the flickering light. She was wearing a deep crimson silk robe, one he didn't recognize, tied loosely at the waist. Her hair was curled and cascaded over her shoulders, and her lips glistened with a shade of red that made his heart skip. "What's this?" he asked, managing a smile despite the sudden wave of unease washing over him. "A surprise," she said, her voice smooth, almost practiced. "You've been working so hard, and I thought, why not give my husband a warm welcome home?" Her words sounded right, but something in her tone was off. It wasn't the Monica he knew. It was someone performing, someone hiding something beneath the surface. Still, Scott pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to his own fatigue. He walked toward her, his hands reaching for her waist. But before he could close the gap, Monica stepped back. A smile played on her lips, but her eyes carried an intensity that made Scott pause. "Wait," she said, raising a hand. "There's more." From the hallway, he heard footsteps, several sets of them. His heart rate spiked as 3 men emerged, each one leering in a way that turned Scott's unease into outright dread. They were strangers, rough-looking, the kind of men who seemed out of place in his carefully maintained suburban home. "Monica," Scott said, his voice low, tinged with warning. "What is this?" She tilted her head, her smile faltering for just a moment. Then her expression hardened, and she crossed her arms. "This is payback." "Payback?" Scott echoed, the word tasting foreign in his mouth. "For what?" "For cheating on me," Monica snapped, her voice rising. "Don't even try to deny it, Scott. I know what you did in Chicago. I know about her." Scott froze, stunned into silence. Deborah. The name hung unspoken between them, but the accusation was clear. "Monica, nothing happened. Don't you dare lie to me," she shouted, her voice cracking. "I'm not stupid, Scott. I know you were with her. I know you've been sneaking around behind my back." Scott's mind reeled. "Monica, I wasn't sneaking around. Deborah is an old friend. We talked, that's it. Talked? She spat, her laugh sharp and bitter. You expect me to believe that? After everything I've put into this marriage? After all the times I've stood by you while you worked late, went on trips, made excuses? He took a step toward her, his hands outstretched. Monica, you're misunderstanding. Enough, she snapped, cutting him off. You don't get to make me feel crazy, Scott. Not anymore. Her eyes gleamed with something feral, unhinged. She turned to the men and gave a small nod. Scott barely had time to register what was happening before one of them lunged at him, shoving him backward onto the couch. The others closed in, and Scott's protests were drowned out by their laughter. The next moments were a blur of humiliation and rage. Monica stood over him, her arms crossed, her lips curled into a cruel smirk. Now, she said, her voice cold, you're going to feel what it's like to be betrayed. Scott's world spun as the men jeered, and Monica's revenge unfolded before him in a twisted, calculated display. His pleas fell on deaf ears, his attempts to fight back met with overpowering force. And through it all, Monica watched, her expression unreadable. When it was over, the men left without a word, and Monica finally spoke. I hope you understand now, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and satisfaction. This is what happens when you destroy someone's trust. Scott stared at her, his chest heaving, his vision blurred by tears he hadn't realized were falling. Monica, he rasped, his voice raw. You've destroyed us. She froze, her confident facade cracking for just a moment. But before she could respond, Scott pushed past her, grabbing his keys and walking out the door without looking back. The cold night air hit him like a slap, but it was nothing compared to the storm raging inside him. As he drove aimlessly, tears streaming down his face, one thought echoed in his mind. This is the end. Scott didn't remember much about the drive. The streetlights blurred together in his peripheral vision as he gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. His heart pounded in his chest, an erratic rhythm that matched the storm of emotions swirling in his mind. Shame, rage, betrayal. He felt suffocated by the weight of it all, the events of the evening replaying on a cruel loop in his head. When he finally stopped, he found himself in the parking lot of a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The neon vacancy sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow. He sat in the car for what felt like hours, his hands still gripping the wheel. What now? Scott's life had imploded in a matter of hours. Everything he thought he knew, his marriage, his home, his sense of safety, was gone. With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone. The screen lit up with missed calls and text from Monica. He stared at the notifications, her name glaring at him like an accusation. Monica, we need to talk. I'm sorry, please come home. Monica, I didn't mean for it to go this far. Monica, Scott, please. I'll explain everything. Scott swiped the messages away and turned off his phone. He didn't want to hear her excuses, her twisted justifications. There was no explanation that could undo what she had done. He checked into the motel with cash, avoiding the clerk's curious gaze. The room was dim and smelled faintly of mildew, but it didn't matter. It was a place to hide, to be alone. Once inside, Scott sank onto the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the stained carpet. His chest ached, and his throat felt tight. He hadn't cried like this in years, but now the tears came in torrents, unstoppable and raw. How did it come to this? The memory of Monica's face burned in his mind. The smug satisfaction in her smile, the venom in her voice. She had planned this, premeditated it. This wasn't a moment of anger. It was calculated cruelty. For hours, Scott sat in the dark, wrestling with his emotions. He replayed every interaction with Monica over the past few months, searching for signs he might have missed. Was there a moment when she had started to pull away? Was there something he had done that had driven her to this? But no matter how much he searched, he kept coming back to the same conclusion. He had done nothing to deserve this. By the time the sun rose, Scott's despair had hardened into resolve. He knew what he had to do. He pulled out his laptop and logged into their joint bank accounts. His fingers flew across the keys as he transferred every penny into his own account, leaving just enough to cover the bills for the next month. Next, he canceled their shared credit cards, shutting down access before Monica could even think to use them. The symbolic final act came when he opened a drawer in the motel room and took out the small Gideon Bible. Tucking his wedding ring between its pages, he left it on the nightstand before walking out the door. Scott spent the next 2 days living out of his car, driving aimlessly and searching for clarity. By Tuesday, he found himself parked in front of a downtown law firm. The receptionist gave him a sympathetic smile as she handed him the divorce paperwork. He spent the better part of an hour filling out every detail of their shared life. Everything they had built together, now reduced to cold, clinical terms. When it was done, he walked back to his car and sat behind the wheel, staring at the signed documents. A strange calm settled over him. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was a step toward reclaiming control. The fallout from Monica's betrayal extended far beyond their marriage. Scott returned to their home one final time, waiting until Monica was at work. The house felt hollow, stripped of its warmth and familiarity. He packed what little he could fit into his car: clothes, personal documents, a few keepsakes that mattered to him. The rest he left behind, like shedding the skin of a life that no longer fit. As he locked the front door for the last time, Scott felt a pang of sadness, but it was overshadowed by the anger simmering beneath the surface. He left the key in the mailbox with a simple note. "This is yours now. I'm done." Scott drove south, not entirely sure where he was going. He'd accepted a job offer in Atlanta months ago, a promising opportunity he had been hesitant to take. Now, it felt like fate had made the decision for him. By the time he crossed the Georgia state line, he felt lighter, as if the physical distance from Monica was stripping away some of the weight of her betrayal. But the memories clung to him like shadows, whispering doubts and anger into the edges of his thoughts. Could he ever trust again? Would he ever find peace? Scott didn't have the answers, but for the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe. He had a long road ahead, but at least now, it was his road to walk. Atlanta greeted Scott with its sprawling skyline and warm autumn breeze. It was a city of reinvention, where no one knew him or the wreckage of the life he had left behind. His new apartment, a modest one-bedroom tucked away on the 3rd floor of a clean but unassuming complex, was sparse but functional. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal. It was a blank slate, something Scott desperately needed. The first week was a blur of onboarding at his new job and setting up his apartment. His colleagues at the tech consulting firm were polite but distant, and Scott was grateful for it. He wasn't ready to connect with anyone just yet. All he wanted was to focus on his work and put as much distance as possible between himself and the chaos he had fled. Despite his resolve to move forward, the nights were the hardest. Alone in his apartment, with no one to talk to and nothing to distract him, his thoughts inevitably drifted back to Monica, not to her betrayal, but to the life they had once shared. The laughter over silly sitcoms, the quiet moments in bed on lazy Sunday mornings, and the way her hand had always found his in a crowded room. How did it all go so wrong? Scott shook his head, trying to banish the thoughts. That life was over. He needed to let it go. One Friday night, Scott found himself sitting at a dimly lit bar a few blocks from his apartment. He hadn't planned on going out, but the thought of another silent evening had pushed him out the door. He nursed a beer, staring into the amber liquid as conversations buzzed around him. "Mind if I sit here?" The voice was soft but confident. Scott looked up to see a striking woman with short blonde hair and a warm smile. She wasn't overly made up or flashy, just effortlessly beautiful. "Sure," he said, gesturing to the empty stool. "I'm Aaron," she said, extending a hand. "Scott," he replied, shaking her hand and feeling a strange flutter in his chest. Their conversation started awkwardly, as most do with strangers, but before long, they were laughing about the bad bar music and swapping stories about their respective moves to Atlanta. Aaron had relocated from Seattle for a job in marketing and seemed to radiate an easy confidence that Scott found magnetic. "So," she said, tilting her head, "what brings you to Atlanta?" Scott hesitated, swirling his beer. "Fresh start," he said finally. "Needed a change." Aaron didn't press, instead nodding knowingly. "I get that. Sometimes you just have to hit reset." The night stretched on, the two of them talking until the bar's closing lights flickered. As they stepped outside, Scott felt lighter, as though a part of the weight he carried had shifted. "Thanks for the company," Erin said, her smile soft under the streetlights. "Yeah," Scott replied, meaning it. They exchanged numbers, and as Erin disappeared into the night, Scott felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in months: hope. The following weeks brought a cautious rhythm to Scott's life. He threw himself into his job during the day and began exploring Atlanta in the evenings. Sometimes he'd walk along the Beltline Trail or lose himself in a crowded bookstore. Other nights, he met Erin for drinks or dinner. They weren't dating, not officially, but there was an undeniable connection. Erin was easy to be around, her humor sharp and her energy contagious. She didn't pry into Scott's past, which he appreciated, but every now and then, he caught her studying him, as if sensing the scars he wasn't ready to reveal. One night, over dinner, Erin asked the question Scott had been dreading. "Are you running from something?" Scott froze, his fork hovering over his plate. He could feel her gaze on him, steady but not judgmental. "I guess you could say that," he admitted, his voice low. Erin nodded, leaning back in her chair. "We all have things we're running from," she said. "The question is, are you running toward something better?" The simplicity of her words struck Scott harder than he expected. Was he running toward something better? Or was he just running? Despite the new beginnings, Monica's shadow wasn't far behind. Late one evening, Scott received a call from an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Scott." Monica's voice came through the line, hesitant but unmistakable. He felt his stomach twist. "What do you want?" I just needed to hear your voice," she said, her tone wavering. "I've been a mess since you left." Scott's grip tightened on the phone. "You've got a lot of nerve, Monica. After what you did." "I know," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "I know I hurt you, Scott. I wasn't thinking straight. I was angry. I thought you cheated and You thought?" Scott's voice was sharp, incredulous. "You didn't even bother to ask. You just did what you did." There was silence on the line, broken only by Monica's muffled sobs. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I can't change what I did, but I'm begging you. Give me a chance to make it right." Scott closed his eyes, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "It's too late, Monica. Whatever we had, it's gone. You made sure of that." And with that, he hung up, his chest heavy but resolute. That night, as Scott lay in bed, Erin's words echoed in his mind. "Are you running towards something better?" He didn't have the answer yet, but one thing was certain. There was no going back. Scott stepped out onto his apartment balcony, the glow of Atlanta's skyline casting long shadows over his quiet street. He sipped from a tumbler of whiskey, the warmth doing little to dull the storm inside him. Monica's voice still echoed in his mind from their last conversation, pleading, apologizing, desperate. It had been 2 weeks since she'd found him. 2 weeks of her persistent calls and texts, each one more frantic than the last. He had ignored most of them, but every now and then, curiosity, or masochism, would win out and he'd open a message. "Monica, I'm sorry for everything. Please, just let me explain. Monica, I know I hurt you, but I didn't know what else to do. I thought you betrayed me. Monica, we can fix this, Scott. I still love you." Scott scoffed, tossing back the rest of his drink. Love. What a hollow word coming from her lips. Whatever love they'd once shared had been obliterated the night she orchestrated her twisted revenge. Still, despite everything, he couldn't shake the gnawing question. How had it come to this? The answer arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening, uninvited and unrelenting. Scott had just returned from work, his shoulders aching from the weight of a long day. As he unlocked his apartment door, a familiar voice stopped him cold. "Scott." He turned, his jaw tightening as he saw her. Monica stood at the base of the stairs, her hair damp from the drizzle, her eyes wide and pleading. "What the hell are you doing here?" Scott growled, his voice low but sharp. "I had to see you," she said, taking a cautious step closer. "You wouldn't answer my calls, and I—" "Because I have nothing to say to you," Scott interrupted, his tone icy. "Leave, Monica." "Please," she said, her voice cracking. Just give me 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Scott hesitated, every instinct telling him to walk inside and slam the door. But the exhaustion in her voice, the sheer desperation, gave him pause. With a frustrated sigh, he nodded toward the covered bench by the entrance. 5 minutes, he said flatly. No more. Monica nodded, clutching her purse like it was a lifeline as she followed him to the bench. They sat in silence for a moment, the rain a steady hum around them. I'm sorry, Monica began, her voice trembling. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know how much I regret what I did. Scott laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Regret? You didn't just hurt me, Monica. You destroyed everything. You planned it. You invited those men into our home, and you stood there watching while... He broke off, his voice shaking with anger. I thought you cheated on me, she said quietly, tears spilling down her cheeks. When you left for Chicago and I found that note from her, the one from Deborah, I thought... Wait, Scott cut in, his brow furrowing. What note? Monica hesitated, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from her purse. She handed it to him with trembling hands. Scott unfolded it, his stomach sinking as he recognized Deborah's handwriting. Scott, great seeing you again. Let's meet for lunch before you leave. I'll call you. Scott clenched his jaw, the pieces clicking into place. You saw this and jumped to the worst conclusion, he said, his voice low. What was I supposed to think? Monica shot back, her tone defensive now. You never mentioned her, and then you disappear for a weekend and come back acting distant. So your solution was to destroy me? Scott snapped, his anger boiling over. To humiliate me in the most disgusting way possible? Do you have any idea what you've done? Monica sobbed, her hands clutching her face. I wasn't thinking, Scott. I was angry, and I thought I'd lost you. You didn't lose me, Scott said, his voice cold. You threw me away. Monica's sobs quieted, her shoulders slumping as she looked at him. I'll do anything to fix this, she whispered. I'll go to therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. Just don't leave me like this. Scott stared at her, his chest tight. A part of him wanted to believe her, to cling to the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be repaired. But the memory of that night, the betrayal, loomed too large. It's too late, Monica, he said finally, his voice steady. You crossed a line I can't come back from. Monica shook her head, tears streaming down her face. You don't mean that. We can fix this. I'll prove it to you. Scott stood, his hands trembling at his sides. Don't follow me again. Don't call. Don't text. This is over. As he walked away, Monica's sobs echoed behind him, a haunting reminder of the life they had lost. That night, Scott sat alone in his apartment, staring at his phone. Deborah's name sat in his contacts, untouched since Chicago. For a fleeting moment, he considered calling her, asking why she had left that note, why she had stirred up a chaos that destroyed his life. But then he set the phone down. Deborah wasn't the problem. Monica wasn't the only one who needed to move on. So did he. Scott poured himself another drink and stared out at the city lights. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He would never let himself fall into the same trap again. The text arrived in the middle of a quiet evening, the sound of Scott's phone buzzing against the coffee table, cutting through the soft hum of the television. He reached for it, expecting a work notification or maybe even a message from Aaron. Instead, Monica's name flashed across the screen, dragging a groan from his lips. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the notification. Every fiber of his being told him to ignore it, to let it disappear into the digital void. But curiosity, or maybe some lingering masochism, got the better of him. Monica, I know about the men, Scott. I know what you've been doing. His chest tightened as he read the words again, his mind immediately racing. What was she talking about? A second text came through a moment later. Monica, they told me everything. You think you can just get away with this? Scott set the phone down, his pulse quickening. He leaned back into the couch, staring at the ceiling as anger and confusion churned in his stomach. What kind of game was she playing now? The answer came 3 days later, when Monica showed up uninvited again. This time, Scott heard the knock while making coffee, the rhythm sharp and insistent. He glanced at the clock. It was barely 7 a.m. With a sigh, he walked to the door, already bracing himself for whatever chaos awaited on the other side. When he opened it, Monica stood there, rain dripping from her hair, her face pale and drawn. She shoved her way inside before Scott could protest, her eyes wild with fury. "Do you think I'm stupid?" she snapped, whirling to face him. "Good morning to you too," Scott muttered, closing the door. "Don't play coy with me," she hissed, her voice trembling with anger. "I know what you've done to them." Scott frowned, crossing his arms. "What are you talking about?" Monica stepped closer, her finger jabbing toward his chest. "The men from that night. They've been attacked, beaten, hospitalized. And don't even try to tell me it's a coincidence, Scott." Her words hit him like a punch, but he kept his expression neutral. "I had nothing to do with that," he said evenly. "Don't lie to me," Monica shouted, her voice cracking. "You've always been good at keeping your cool, haven't you? But I know you, Scott. You can act all high and mighty, but deep down, you're just as vindictive as anyone else." Scott felt a flash of anger, but forced himself to stay calm. "Let me get this straight," he said slowly. "You're accusing me of, what? Hunting them down and roughing them up?" "They said someone hired guys to do it," Monica said, her voice quieter now. "Someone who wanted them to pay for what they did." Scott shook his head, incredulous. "Maybe they pissed off someone else. It's not exactly hard to imagine, considering the kind of people they are." Monica's eyes searched his, desperation mingling with anger. "So you're saying you had nothing to do with it? That you didn't retaliate?" Scott stepped back, his gaze hard. "I don't owe you an explanation, Monica, but for what it's worth, no, I didn't do anything. I'm not like you." Her face crumpled at his words, a fresh wave of tears threatening to spill. "I know I ruined everything," she whispered. "I know I hurt you. But I don't want this war between us." "There's no war," Scott said coldly, "because we're done. You don't matter to me anymore." Monica's breath hitched, but she didn't argue. She turned toward the door, her shoulders slumping. "You say that," she murmured, "but you're still angry. I can see it. And it's eating you alive." Scott didn't respond, watching as she walked out the door. The sound of it closing echoed through the room, leaving an uneasy silence in its wake. The encounter left Scott rattled. He wanted to believe his hands were clean, that he had taken the higher road by walking away. But Monica's accusations planted seeds of doubt. He thought back to the months following that night, how angry, humiliated, and powerless he had felt. He had fantasized about revenge, about making those men suffer the way he had suffered. But those thoughts had stayed locked in his head, hadn't they? Scott poured himself a drink, his fingers trembling as he lifted the glass. Could someone else have taken action on his behalf? A friend? A colleague? Or was this just Monica's attempt to drag him back into her orbit, using guilt as a weapon? He stared out the window at the city below, the skyline glittering like 1,000 fractured promises. That evening, Scott received another text, not from Monica, but from Aaron. "Aaron, drinks tonight? My treat." He hesitated, staring at the screen. Aaron was a breath of fresh air, a lifeline to something normal and good. But tonight, the weight of Monica's accusations hung heavy on him, the threads of his old life refusing to let him go. He typed out a reply, "Not tonight. Sorry." Setting the phone aside, Scott leaned back on the couch, closing his eyes. He wanted to believe he could leave the past behind, that he could move forward unburdened. But Monica's words lingered, whispering in the dark corners of his mind. "You're still angry, and it's eating you alive." The sound of furniture being dragged echoed through the hallway as Scott unlocked the door to his apartment. He froze for a moment, listening. It was coming from the unit across the hall, one that had been vacant since he'd moved in. A sinking feeling churned in his stomach. Surely, it couldn't be. He closed his door and leaned against it, willing the thought away. But minutes later, a knock shattered the fragile peace. When Scott opened the door, his worst fears stood before him. Monica, looking fragile yet determined, gave him a tentative smile. "Hi, Scott. What the hell are you doing here?" he asked, his voice sharp, all pretense of politeness gone. "I moved in," she said, gesturing behind her to the open door of the apartment across the hall. For a moment, Scott couldn't speak. His mouth opened, then closed, his brain scrambling for logic in this madness. "You moved in," he repeated slowly. "Across the hall? Are you insane?" "I'm not trying to invade your life," Monica said quickly, her words tumbling over each other. I wanted to be close, to show you I'm serious about fixing things." "Fixing things?" Scott laughed bitterly. "Monica, you nuked our life and now you're stalking me. Do you even hear yourself?" "I'm not stalking you," she said, her voice rising defensively. "I just want a chance to prove I can be better, that we can heal." Scott clenched his jaw, his fists curling at his sides. "We are beyond healing. This isn't romantic or noble. It's desperate and pathetic." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't move. "I love you, Scott," she whispered. "I know I've done terrible things, but I can't give up on us. I won't." "You should have thought about that before you invited those men into our home," he snapped. "You don't love me, Monica. You just hate losing." Her shoulders sagged as the tears spilled over. "I've lost everything," she said quietly. "You. Our life. I sold the house because I couldn't bear to live there without you." Scott took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "You didn't lose me, Monica. You threw me away. And now you're grasping at straws, hoping I'll forget everything you did. But I can't. And I won't." Her lip quivered, and for a moment, Scott almost felt a pang of pity. Almost. But the memory of that night, the humiliation, the betrayal, was a fire that burned too hot to be extinguished. "Do you think you can move in here and wait me out? Wear me down?" he asked, his voice cold. "It's not going to happen. You can live across the hall, down the street, or in the next city. I don't care. You're nothing to me now." Monica flinched as though he'd struck her, but she stood her ground. "You're angry now," she said, her voice trembling. "But I'll wait, Scott, however long it takes. Because I believe in us, even if you don't." Scott laughed darkly, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? There is no us. There hasn't been for a long time." Without another word, he stepped back inside and slammed the door in her face. The next few days passed in tense silence. Monica didn't knock again, but Scott was hyper-aware of her presence across the hall. Every time he left for work or returned home, he half expected to see her waiting by her door, but she remained invisible, like a ghost haunting the edges of his life. Scott buried himself in work and leaned on Erin for comfort, though he never told her about Monica's proximity. It felt too shameful, too raw. Erin brought lightness to his life, her laughter and easy demeanor a balm against the storm raging inside him. But even Erin couldn't erase the lingering dread that came with Monica's presence. One evening, as Scott returned from a late dinner with Erin, he found Monica sitting on the floor in front of her door. She looked up as he approached, her eyes red and puffy. "I don't want to fight anymore," she said softly. Scott stopped, his shoulders tensing. "Then stop. Leave me alone, Monica." She stood slowly, her movements hesitant. "I've started seeing a therapist. I'm trying to figure out why I became this person." "That's good," Scott said flatly. "You should have done it years ago." Her face crumpled, but she nodded. "I know I've hurt you more than I can ever make up for. I needed you to know that I'm trying to change, even if it doesn't matter anymore." "It doesn't," Scott said, his voice firm. "But I hope you figure it out. For your sake, not mine." She gave him a sad smile, stepping aside to let him pass. "Good night, Scott," she murmured. "Good night, Monica," he replied, already walking away. Over the next few months, Scott focused on his new life. Monica became a distant memory, a shadow he had finally learned to live with. Erin became more than just a companion. She became a partner, someone who showed him what it felt like to trust again. And Monica? She remained across the hall, silent and unseen. Whether she was waiting or had finally accepted the truth, Scott didn't know. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't care. Because for Scott Bennett, life had finally moved on.